and welcome to the Doxy Bracey Center for Human Reconciliation's Let's Talk webinar series. My name is Paul Bracey, and I'm the founder and president of the center. Tonight's topic is At the Crossroads, Immigration Today. We have an excellent speaker, attorney Ivan Espinoza-Madrigal, who along with his colleagues are on the front line of this issue. Before I introduce him this evening, I'd like to talk a little bit about the organization, some background. The center was founded in 2020 as a 501c3 nonprofit focused on human reconciliation. Our programs are free, run by volunteers, and funded by donations from people like yourself. Please consider making a donation if you haven't already. Thank you. My personal thanks to Joanne Ziddick, who is our events coordinator, and Randy Wilding, who is our chief operating officer, and our team for tonight's presentation. The presentation and questions and answers will be in English and Spanish, a first for the center. President Trump hasn't shied away from ignoring court orders and violating legal norms in his push to remove non-citizens, in some instances, citizens. This administration's message to non-citizens is clear. Regardless how long you've been here or the dangers you face back home, if deemed not to belong, you will be detained, expelled without a chance to defend yourself, often being put on planes and sometimes disappearing completely. Donald Trump is a bully who doesn't believe in the U.S. Constitution, though he has taken an oath to defend it, and displays white racist sentiments. He is undermining the fundamental rights to due process from several directions, whether by intimidating law firms, defying threatening judges, or attempting to defund children's attorneys. The aim appears to cut off immigrants' access to legal representation, while in effect to erode their civil liberties. At the same time, he's attacking refugee rights. He is also attacking American civil rights through limiting voting rights, supporting bans on books, undermining efforts at achieving equality in the country by attacking DEI efforts and sending National Guard troops and U.S. Marines into cities to quell people's rights to protest his policies, to name a few actions. Chilling. Who's next? Tonight's speaker is the executive director of Lawyers for Civil Rights, founded during the civil rights movement at President John F. Kennedy's request. Yvonne has 20 years experience in civil rights, immigration, and public policy, handling complex federal and appellate cases. He represents clients from various sectors in areas like immigration, education, housing, voting rights, public health, environmental justice, entrepreneurship, workplace diversity, and LGBTQ plus rights. Please join me in welcoming this evening our speaker. Welcome, Yvonne.
Thank you, Mr. Bracey. It is such a pleasure and an honor to be here with you tonight and with your colleagues and with so many guests and participants who are joining us in the Zoom this evening. We are at over 50 people now, and it keeps building, which is terrific to be able to be in community with all of you. Tonight, I want to share a little bit about my personal journey. I want to share a little bit about Lawyers for Civil Rights and its inspiring origins. And I want to share more about how we are responding to the current moment and what are some highlights, particularly at the intersection and crossroads of immigration and civil rights and what's happening in the courts. And so welcome to everyone tonight. I'll start with my own personal journey and share a little bit about myself. I was born in Costa Rica. I grew up on a small rural farm, helping out on the farm and going to the local church and doing other aspects of village life are some of my fondest childhood memories. And at the same time, there was a tremendous amount of conflict and turmoil in much of Central America, because in the early 80s in particular, the civil wars were raging in countries like El Salvador, and also in neighboring countries like Nicaragua. And even though our farm and very idyllic rural life was very meaningful, it was also surrounded by upheaval. This included refugee camps not far from my home, and it was increasingly clear that instability in Central America was quite something that would have to be contended with. And seeking greater stability and opportunity, my mom moved me and my brother to the United States back in the 1980s. And when we first arrived in the United States, we lived in a low-income apartment complex, a predominantly minority and immigrant community. My mom worked very long hours to be able to put food on the table as a single mom, but we still didn't have access to many things, including health insurance. And it took a long time for my family to be able to really get their footing and to be able to participate more fully in the American dream, which is something that has been inculcated in me by my mom since I was little. The idea that through hard work, you are able to create opportunities for yourself and for your family in America. And after many years of struggle and sacrifice, my family was able to really move forward and push forward. And I was extraordinarily blessed and privileged to be able to go to college, the first person in my family to go to school, and also to go to law school. And while I was on campus at the University of Pennsylvania and at New York University, where I went for law school, it was really apparent for me that there was tremendous social distance between my own lived experience, particularly as an immigrant, as somebody who came from a low-income background, and the predominantly affluent student population that surrounded me. There were very few students who actually grew up in poverty. There were very few students who shared immigrant experiences. And many of my peers didn't have to take out student loans or rely on financial aid because their families were covering those things for them, if not in whole, at least in great part. And I, through great determination and great discipline, was able to get my bachelor's degree in 3 years to avoid incurring too much student debt, and went to law school on a public interest scholarship to be able to do the work that I do today, which is to be able to provide free legal services to people from low-income backgrounds and from underprivileged backgrounds, people who have lived experiences that in many ways resemble what I went through, people who lived in low-income communities with underperforming public schools, people who grew up in public housing projects or in other conditions of vulnerability, people who grew up without health insurance. And many of these are the clients that I have the privilege and pleasure of representing today as Executive Director of Lawyers for Civil Rights, which is a nonprofit organization that does everything for free on behalf of our clients. As Mr. Bracy was alluding to, my organization is quite storied and historic. We were founded in the 1960s at the height of the civil rights movement at the request of President John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. They summoned about 250 leading American lawyers in the East Room of the White House back in 1963. And they specifically talked about the role that lawyers must play to participate in the civil rights movement. And the message was very clear. It was our moral duty, our professional duty to help move the civil rights movement from the streets to the courtroom. At the time when this meeting took place, many people across the country were seeing devastating images. People were shaken about what was happening in news accounts and on the television about police-led violence against peaceful demonstrators who were being led by Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., or by the spectacle of U.S. Army intervention to enforce court orders for integrating institutions like the University of Alabama, which admitted Black students against a defiant Governor Wallace. And President Kennedy noted the special role that lawyers played in the creation and maintenance of our constitutional system of government in the rule of law. And I don't like to use those type of fancy words like rule of law, because what does that ultimately mean? What I think it means is access to justice, to be able to have your day in court, which is one of the most fundamental things that each and every one of us should be entitled to, regardless of how we grew up, what zip code we come from, or what is our background. Something so fundamental to being American and to being able to enjoy the privilege of being part of this American society. This is especially important to someone like me who comes from a region of the world where these guarantees, where these liberties, where access to justice, where access to courts is not a reality. And I repeat that, it's not a reality. And it is with even more zeal that I actively work to make sure that my organization continues to do the modern day manifestations of that work that we were leading in 1960s, when we were integrating institutions, when we were desegregating institutions. And all of that work manifests in making sure that students have an opportunity to learn with and from each other in integrated classrooms, the opportunity to have access to housing, even for people who have Section 8 vouchers, people who often landlords are trying to exclude. And that also includes, most recently, work on behalf of immigrants who are being targeted and are also being expelled from the United States without an opportunity to see an immigration judge. And that's a little bit about my own background and the work that my organization has done historically and that my organization continues to do. I want to turn to a little bit of take a step back and talk a little bit about framing for the conversation that we are having today. Because many people, some of the first things that they ask me is, so how are you how are you staying strong? How are you continuing to do the work that you do, despite the challenges that surround us, despite the brazen attacks on the judiciary, or the brazen efforts that are getting quite aggressive, often with brutality, for example, of taking immigrants out of a car by force after smashing the windows. And one of the things that for me has been incredibly grounding and that I wish to share with you today is the concept of cathedral thinking, which has been incredibly inspiring for me and something that has helped me think through how we continue to do our work, particularly in times of adversity. And as I alluded to earlier, this is nothing new. We've had struggle and tension as a society and in and out of the courtrooms, even before the civil rights movement came to its conclusion in the 1960s. And what this really means for us as advocates and as concerned people is that we must think about it from a long-term perspective. And much of that is captured in the essence of cathedral thinking, which is something I'm particularly been reading about and writing about as we do the work over the past 6 months. So I want you to imagine this. Go on a journey with me for a second. Imagine that you're standing in the middle of a field, and in your hand you have a single stone, and you're being asked to lay it down to begin the foundation for a building. But you don't know what the completed structure is going to look like, and you're never going to see the final building. You're not going to be around when you see the walls come up or where the structure's coming up. But you are supposed to be laying your stone anyway, and you're supposed to be doing it carefully, and you're supposed to be doing it with intentionality. And this is essentially what cathedral thinking is. It's a term that comes from the awe-inspiring cathedrals of medieval Europe, which are essentially monuments that took centuries to complete. And the people who started working on them, the artisans, the architects that toiled on these structures, they knew that their role was never to finish the structure. It was never to finish this project. It was to begin. It was to start that work, to lay the stone one at a time, to be able to build things like Notre Dame, to be able to build things like Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, which continues to be under construction today. If you've been to Barcelona, you've seen it, and it hasn't been finished yet. And so there's this awareness in cathedral building that you won't see the final structure, but that each contribution is being made with intentionality, because you are teeing up future generations to finish the work that you're starting today. And this is really the journey. And this is what institution building is about. This is what the preservation of rights looks like. This is what creating legal precedent and creating community precedent looks like. And so this framework for me has been one of the most inspiring things in the current times. Even when I wake up on days when all types of adversities are happening, and that is a strategy. It is a strategy of flooding the field, of making sure that there's so many things surrounding us that it's difficult for us to concentrate and to find exactly how we're going to intervene or what we're going to tackle first. And it is precisely in those moments that we have to remember that institutions and communities do not get built overnight, that the type of society that we want to build, the type of cases that we want to win, the type of dignity and respect that we want to see in our society and our culture are centuries in the making. And this is something that should be for us inspiring, because it means that we have to play our role here and now with immediacy, with urgency, with purpose. And it's also this realization that we may not be around to see the results that we want to see in the world around us, but that we have to build it anyway. That this is an obligation that we have, not just as civil rights lawyers, as an advocates, but as people who care about our neighbors and our friends, as people who care about the change that we want to bring in the world. And when you think about our history here in the United States, so let's step out of Europe and come back home. When we think about things closer to home, when we think about what it took to integrate public schools, which is work that lawyers for civil rights did at the height of the civil rights movement, or when we talk about other legal precedents, which I tend to think about as cathedrals of justice in their own right, none of these victories is the product of a moment or the snap of the finger. None of this was conjured in a second. It was the lengthy product of organizing, of litigating, of testing, iterating, waiting, reimagining, returning. It was constant change. It was constant efforts. And what's also striking to me about our history and legacy of civil rights advocacy is that the people who fought for civil rights, the people who marched for voting rights, the people who sat at those lunch counters, and the people who stood in those courtrooms were all laying stones without knowing if change would ever come, if the Supreme Court was ever going to rule in their favor, if federal laws were going to be changed and enforced. But they trusted that each act, that each case, that each protest, that each intervention would form the foundation that future generations like us would be building on and inheriting. And so it's really important for us to think about the world that surrounds us right now as one where we are the builders, where we have to be the visionaries. And by we, I mean this very broadly. It's all of us, all 72 participants in this Zoom right now, and those who will be viewing the video afterwards, that really have to see ourselves as the folks who are laying our stones, even if we don't see the cathedral rise. And that means that we have to speak up. That means we have to act boldly, even if the outcome is uncertain, even if we may lose. And that is exactly how we wake up in the morning and fight to bring light to darkness, even on the darkest days, even on the days with the most adversity. And that's because we have to proactively build the world that we want to live in. We have to build that world where we have access to justice, where we have access to dignity, and where those principles stand as tall as any cathedral. And we also have to realize that this is something that won't happen on its own. We have to do it ourselves, and we have to do it together. And that is one of the most critical lessons right now, is that it's about winning, but not about winning in a moment, but winning across time. And I think having that mentality is one of the things that has inspired me the most as I do my work in the current climate, as I face the challenges that surround us in the current climate, thinking about we are building the future that we want to see, even if sometimes it's not a straight line, and even if sometimes we have to take 2 steps back to be able to move forward. And so that's a little bit about the framing that I want to share with you about today, particularly about the importance of teeing up victories and making sure that we make ourselves open to testing and iterating, even in the context of no certainty of success. And turning now to a little bit of like, so how have we channeled this energy? What have we been doing using this framework? Well, there's a lot that has been keeping us busy. At Lawyers for Civil Rights, we filed a birthright citizenship case on the day of the inauguration. We filed it at midnight, filed it on behalf of immigrant mothers and children who would be stripped of US citizenship because of the Trump administration's narrow view and narrow interpretation of what has been extremely well settled and long-standing law, which is written into the Constitution that anybody born on US soil is a US citizen. And our case is designed to be able to protect that right to citizenship, birthright to citizenship, so that we do not create categories and tiers of citizens, some who have all the rights and privileges of American citizenship and others who are inferior or below that. That's not the way we are built as a society. We don't have tiers of Americans and citizens. Anybody born in the US should have the full bundle of rights that comes from being born in the United States. That's the way it's been for over 100 years, and that's the way that it should continue to be. I won't lie, these cases are being ardently litigated, right? The government is not going to back down from this interpretation of the Constitution, but neither are we. And so this is something that's going to continue to wind its way to the Supreme Court for the court's full vetting and review and to make a determination on whether the longstanding view of birthright citizenship remains or whether the Trump administration's narrower view and the creation of these categories and classes of citizens, some who are subpar, some who are sub-citizens, could be the way of moving forward. And I also won't lie, there's a risk inherent in any litigation, right? I tell clients that in the best of cases, you have a 50-50 chance of winning. And sometimes, particularly when you have judicial forums that are less friendly to progressive values or to individual rights and interpretations of the Constitution that many of us would want to see and that we believe in, the risk is even greater. And so this is going to be quite a fight. And in many ways, it's going to be David versus Goliath. But I have always been on the underdog. As an organization, we have been able to really pull rabbits out of a hat, even in contexts where we're against all the odds. And so I think it's important for us to have trust and faith in the system and trust and faith that the right interpretation of the Constitution is going to win the day and that will protect our families and neighbors. We are also on a separate but parallel track, leading work to be able to protect cities that have deprioritized immigration inquiries. Why is this important? Well, fundamentally because it's a matter of public safety. In many cities, particularly cities that have immigrant populations, people would not feel comfortable coming forward to report crime or to serve as witnesses in investigations unless they knew that there was a separation between local police and federal immigration officials. When you start blurring that line, when local police start acting like immigration officers, or when you run the risk of being referred or passed on to immigration for reporting a crime or for serving as a witness, that completely disincentivizes the public safety system. You are basically pushing victims deeper into the shadow so that they're not reporting crime. They're not coming forward to report domestic violence and other instances of crime. And you're also failing to tap the help of people in the community who have seen or heard something that may be relevant for law enforcement investigations. And so when I think about these immigration issues and how they impact local communities, it is incredibly important for us to keep public safety in mind. What is the best way for these public safety issues to remain front and center so that we can all remain safe, so that if we, for example, are the victims of a hit and run, and it's an immigrant who saw the accident, that immigrant would feel comfortable talking to law enforcement. That's something that helps all of us. All US citizens are protected when we protect all victims and witnesses of crime. And that's why these issues of deprioritizing immigration inquiries is something that should really be left to the discretion of local authorities and local jurisdictions. And that is their right. That is their right under the Constitution, under the 10th Amendment, which says that powers that are not delegated to the federal government are reserved for the states. And so in towns and cities, taking the approach that they do not want to ask victims and witnesses about their immigration status, what we're really seeing is an exercise of 10th Amendment rights. And this is something that has a longstanding history in the American legal system, and that we really should be respecting and honoring, deferring to the public safety expertise of local jurisdictions. And so we're working with many of these local communities to be able to protect public safety by making sure that everyone in the community feels protected. And that's incredibly important work that will have ramifications for towns and cities across the country, because this type of public safety lens is something that is incredibly important from coast to coast, from California to Massachusetts. And so it's critical for all of us to make sure that local jurisdictions can exercise their constitutional right to assume and be able to set their own local priorities, to exercise their police powers that are given to them under the 10th Amendment. And yet on a third parallel track, or third lawsuit against the federal government right now, involves the cancellation of humanitarian protection programs, particularly the cancellation of temporary protected status, TPS, which is a humanitarian program that has protected people from Haiti, people from countries like El Salvador and Honduras, among others, countries that have experienced political instability, countries that have been hit by climate events, by hurricanes, by mudslides, by other climatic events that are incredibly destabilizing, that destroys infrastructure, that takes lives, that prevents people from being able to return back to those countries in a way that is safe for them and their families. So how can a country like Haiti, that has experienced significant political violence and turmoil, not to mention the hurricanes and other climatic events, guarantee the safety of Haitians who are being deported there right now? The bottom line is that it can't. And that is a humanitarian crisis, which is precisely why Congress created temporary protected status. This is not the first time the Trump administration tries to eliminate and cancel TPS. The Trump administration attempted to do so during the first Trump presidency, and there were very successful court efforts to stop that. Those efforts have been revived as the federal government targets Haitians and other people for deportation and also for rescinding their temporary protected status. And so there's, again, litigation that is percolating in federal courts from coast to coast. One of the cases being led by my organization, Lawyers for Civil Rights, where we are protecting the TPS recipients to save TPS, to make sure that TPS remains in place. And there are two things, and with this, I'll start wrapping up so that we can get into the Q&A. But this is important for two important reasons. One is, this is a program authorized by Congress. So the president may have discretion to designate a country under TPS, but the president doesn't have discretion to decide that a congressionally authorized program needs to be shut down completely. Something like that would violate very clear separation of power principles and would also violate the law. This is a law that's on the books. Temporary protected status exists, whether the government wants it or not to exist. It's something that has been around for a long time. And the other reason why it's important to protect this, not just because the government shouldn't be able to cancel programs willy-nilly, it's also because this is a matter of basic human decency, to be able to provide support for people who would be on harm's way in other countries. This is aligned with important principles like making sure that we provide support for asylum seekers and people from other vulnerable identities, people who would be persecuted, for example, if they were a trans woman in their home country, or if their HIV diagnosis became public in certain countries, or people who would be persecuted based on their religious identity. All of these are critically important elements that have been a center part of our immigration programs and policies for decades. and yet chipping away at them, whether it's by making it harder to apply for asylum, or whether it's making it easier to deport and remove someone, or by continuing to rescind programs like temporary protected status, it's a huge disservice. It's a huge disservice to our basic commitment to making sure that people can live lives free of persecution. And that's an American value. That's a central theme of not just our immigration system, but of our society. And so in doing this work, we are preserving and protecting institutions and programs that have a long history of being a part of the American DNA, and programs that should remain in place. And so as we do this work, we're trying to center not just access to justice and access to courts, which are central values, but also making sure that we can keep people's dignity and respect intact, so that they're not targeted just based on who they are, so that they're not targeted based on where they come from, because there are racial and national origin implications to all of this that have become, of course, the grounds of many conversations. And so I'm not here to make a determination on whether something the federal government is doing is evincing some type of effort to violate the civil rights of people who deserve basic protections. I think the most important thing is that we've all seen these stories. We've all heard what's happening. And it's important for us to stay tuned to all of these dynamics, because in just 6 months, so much in the world around us has changed. And the availability of free legal services is going to be one of the most important interventions that will allow us to move forward. And so with that said, I would love to open it up to Q&A now that I've introduced myself, introduced my organization, and introduced some of the work that we've been doing, and some of the framing that I've been describing about cathedral thinking, so that we have a framework for how to operate and how to move forward as advocates, as community leaders. I think that's important for us to be able to think about what we're building today for generations to come, even if everything that surrounds us is challenging, and even if everything that surrounds us can be incredibly debilitating. It is vital for us to keep our sparkle and to be able to do the work that we have to do with integrity, and to be able to protect the lives and experiences that are important to us and to our communities. So I want to turn it to Randy to help us moderate the Q&A portion of the discussion.
Yvonne, thank you so much for joining us this evening, wherever you are. Welcome on behalf of the Bracey Center. Before we do any questions, I just want to extend a sincere thank you to LCR, to your team, and to the work that you all are doing. You, in your talk, have emphasized why it's important to have access to free services, because it provides a level playing field. It enables, it makes sure that there is access, equal access, access that everyone should have, regardless of their background or their socioeconomic advantage, what country they're from. So I would like to take a moment to do two housekeeping things. One is, if you have the ability to make a donation to Yvonne's organization, we would, on behalf of the center, we would like you to take that enthusiasm and your dollars, if you can, and make a contribution to LCR. If you'd like more information about LCR, we have the website in our chat. And the other piece, I'm hoping that by now you have, if you do need simultaneous translation in Spanish language, it is provided, which you should have received a link as well in our pre-event. We received, I'm not gonna lie, we received a lot of questions in advance of the event. So what we've been trying to do on our side is to categorize them and to triage them as best we can. We also want you, the participants, our 74 participants that are live this evening, to, if you have a question that you want answered, please ask it. We may not be able to get to it, but you should still ask the question, and we may find a way of being able to follow up with you if we're not able to address it this evening. So without further ado, let's get to the questions. My eyes are going to be all around the screen, so I am paying attention, I promise. I have notes on one document. I have my Post-it notes that I took while everyone was talking, and I have our chat wide open. So please don't hold back. Right now we have 4 open questions. And I'm going to start with those, Yvonne, the ones that are coming in from the live Q&A. And then I'm going to switch to more personal backstory and also my own questions. And then we'll hit the other, some of the questions that we received before the event. Okay, so this is our first question from an anonymous attendee. It does include some lawyer speak, so you might have to translate for me. How can senior attorneys who have not hitherto focused their practices on civil rights support lawyers for civil rights by learning about the practice and possibly applying their legal skills in a supportive role, as opposed to simply making cash contributions, which of course are also needed to support the vital work? Example, is there a research function with some minimal training that a volunteer lawyer can perform and add value to your advocacy? I know that the answer is yes, so I can't wait to hear how.
And this also, I think, dovetails into the next question, which is about, and I like the framing of the question, like, how do we keep trust and faith in something like cathedral thinking and systems change when many of the institutions that we're supposed to be relying on seem biased or compromised? And so I think both of these questions call several things into mind. One is, how did we get here in this particular moment? And I think we got here because there is a large segment of the country that is disillusioned with the way things are. I alluded in my earlier remarks about the American dream because I think that has a lot to do with what we're seeing. If you ask me, I think many people have lost faith in the American dream. They don't think that their kids will be able to have a better life than what they were able to accomplish. They look around and they see the prices for apartments and housing, and they think, like, this is beyond the scope of what I could ever be able to afford. Housing being one of the things that unifies us right now. If you knock on any door, whether it's a low-income family or an affluent family, they will all tell you that the rent is too damn high. Like, that's just the reality. And so there are all of these social and economic circumstances that surround us that are creating tremendous tension and frustration. And I also think there's been a failure of political responsiveness. We haven't seen politicians necessarily take on these hard issues of, how do we make sure people have living wage? How do we make sure that people have access to housing and affordability in housing? And how do we make sure that our immigration system, which is irreparably broken, gets fixed? and gets fixed in a way that works for all of us. It gets fixed with some of the fundamentals of what we need, like gets fixed in ways that addresses labor shortages without necessarily competing with traditionally American jobs. Or how do we create ways to reinforce family unification and not have people wait in line for 20 years to be able to do that? So we're dealing with broken systems, whether it's in the housing space, in the socioeconomic space, or in the immigration space, that have led us to this moment. And so I want to be very clear about that, because this didn't just happen by happenstance. And this is not something that can be solved one-dimensionally. This is going to take significant work to be done. And part of the work also is reaching out across the aisle and making sure that we're not demonizing each other and that we're not demonizing the other side. There's a tremendous amount of winning, not just in the court of law, but in the court of public opinion, and changing hearts and minds in ways that are meaningful. And at Lawyers for Civil Rights, we're doing a lot of that work. For example, representing the residents of modular homes in a mobile home park who reached out to us saying, our rent was just raised 5 times. And this is an unconscionable increase. Like, we have nowhere to turn. Can you please help us to make sure that we can remain in this mobile home park? And so we're going to meet with clients at the mobile home park, and Fox News is, raging in the background, and we're representing the clients, because this is important. It's important for all of us to see ourselves reflected in the civil rights movement. It's important for all of us to understand that our rights and our dignity need to be respected. And so the work that lies ahead is incredibly multifaceted. And legal solutions, like I mentioned earlier, are a critical part of the solution, but there's also going to have to be immigration reform, and immigration reform happens in Congress. And there also needs to be more attention to how the judicial system, whether it's the state judicial system or the federal judicial system, operates. And there's a tremendous amount of polarization right now that is not helpful. And that polarization is not just happening in Congress, it's also happening in courtrooms. And so the solution here is complex, but I think that with an eye towards making change, making reform, making progress, that's the path forward. It's not giving up. It's not basically adopting, and I've heard this, and I don't want to be derogatory, but I've heard a lot of, well, right now what we just need to do is wait on the sidelines and let the dust settle. Or in some circles, what I'm hearing as well, strategic silence. We should just not say anything, not do anything, and then see where things go. Well, that's not the approach we can really have. The approach we need is proactive, and it's proactive at every facet. It's proactive from the courts. It's proactive to mobilize politicians. It's proactive in terms of building narratives and winning over people who we've lost, including immigrants themselves who are in favor of Trump's deportation machine. Because let's be clear, that is a reality. And so when lawyers are asking, like, well, how do we participate in this process? I would give examples of, we obviously always need help with pro bono cases. Pro bono assistance is needed now more than ever. And this is at every level. It's large law firms that need to continue to take on cases that would be too complex or costly for us to do on our own, because maybe it's too many depositions, maybe it's too much discovery and evidence and fact-finding. But it's also about other interventions. Recently in the immigration space, there's been a lot of concerns about families that are being torn apart by deportation and removal. If the parents are deported, what happens to the children? And in many of those instances, what they need is not immigration assistance because they already have an immigration lawyer. It's a family lawyer. It's a family lawyer who's going to guide them through, how do you set up a guardianship? And is the guardianship the best solution for you if you get deported, so that your kids can have a guardian in place to be able to take them to school, take them to doctor's appointment, make important decisions, or assist in the reunification of the children with the deported parents. And so all of a sudden, there's a huge need for family law attorneys in the space, something that maybe you didn't see yourself as a family law attorney as part of the civil rights movement or as part of the immigration movement. But here we go, like this is the opening. And so there are many examples. I'm using that as one, but I really think that there are many opportunities to be engaged. Even if your cup of tea is not litigation, we're seeing many small businesses that are trying to navigate the new normal. Like, what are the ways that I can function and be set up in the new DEI landscape? And so advising a business on DEI issues is an incredible intervention right now. Or advising a business that's owned by an immigrant who may be at risk of being deported. And let's also be clear here: the people who are being gathered by the federal government right now are not just criminal aliens, right? There are many instances, including folks who were representing at Lawyers for Civil Rights, who were rounded up even though they have lawful status. And so there's disruption. There's disruption to the family unit. There's disruption to a business, right? And so lawyers can play a really important role, even if what you're doing is supporting through family law or supporting through transactional and contracts for small businesses in the new normal created by not just a wake of the immigration proceedings, but the DEI changes. And so there are many ways for attorneys to be involved. And I would say, just because not everybody joining us tonight is a lawyer, there are other ways for other people to be involved. In many states, recording law enforcement is completely lawful. And so if you're in a state where you're seeing something go down and you're a bystander and you decide to exercise your right to record, that is your right. That's your right to be able to do that. And there are going to be instances where there's going to be pressure. There's going to be maybe an official who says, you can't do that. And there'll be situations where you might have to stand your ground and say, you know, I am recording because it's my right to record, but I am going to move back to create a safe distance so that you know I am not a threat. I am not trying to interfere. I'm not trying to obstruct. You know, I'm trying to be respectful, but I am going to record because it's my right to record. I'm going to do it from this distance. Is this okay? Or would you like me to move back? But I'm going to record. And there are ways to have those conversations that are completely respectful and even deferential to law enforcement while not sacrificing your own constitutional rights. And so there are many interventions that we could be thinking about that are not just legal in nature, but where we bear witness to what's happening in the communities around us, and where we can help create a paper trail or a record of what's happening, because that's how these stories are getting to the news. That's how these stories are being part of the ethos. It's often by bystanders who are seeing what's happening on the ground and who are sharing those stories. And so I want to emphasize that this is not about just lawyers taking action. Again, to go back to that cathedral building imagery, this is about all of us contributing our stone, laying our stone. And sometimes that might be as simple as recording, but that's an incredibly meaningful intervention. And so this is something that we should all be thinking about in terms of like, well, what's the intervention that I could be doing from my vantage point? And I think another thing to do, kind of like that to-do list that's prompted by these questions, is also put pressure on your local officials, put pressure on your state officials, put pressure on your federal officials. Especially, we're joined tonight by people from states blue and red across the country. And so the more your elected officials are hearing from you, the better. And I'm not saying you have to agree with me on everything, right? But I think a lot of what I've described about, do we care about the tenets of public safety? Do you care about being able to stay safe if the only person who saw what happened to you as an immigrant? Think about that, right? So This isn't about being soft on crime. This isn't about I need to put a welcome mat out for immigrants. This is basic public safety. And I'm also thinking about the elements of having the most fundamental protections, right? Being able to apply for asylum when you get persecuted, being able to not get deported to a country where you're not going to be safe. These are just basic premises, right? So I'm not saying that we need to have an open door, and by no means have I ever taken that type of position. I think we should have a very orderly immigration process that allows for oversight and screening and all types of other things. But that requires change and meaningful change. And before we get there, we can't sacrifice our rights, our legal process, because what we have is broken. And so the questions are good questions. And I think there's something for all of us to be thinking about in terms of engagement and doing, that we're being called into action and protecting our neighbors. And so I hope that those examples are examples not just for lawyers to be activated, but for other community members as they think about, well, what could we be doing right now?
Ivan, thank you. What comes to mind specifically around when you say that there are some states that allow recording of law enforcement, what is, in your experience, what's the quickest way for someone to get that information that is correct for them?
In many states, that is something that the Attorney General's office have often created, like fact sheets surrounding this. Like, do you have the right to record law enforcement? A relatively quick, simple Google search, do I have the right to record law enforcement in Mississippi? Should take you to Attorney General or other trusted resources where there is an authoritative information on the subject. And to be clear, not all states allow it, but if you live in a state that does, I think it's good for you to be aware of that, because that's part of your rights, right? That's part of what you could be doing. And I'm not saying that you have to be doing that in any particular scenario, but it's good to know that that is a tool in your tool belt. That is a tool along with being able to contact your elected officials, or if you're a lawyer, being able to provide some type of pro bono support in your area of specialty. And so all of these are kind of like tools in your toolbox that we could be thinking about as we emerge from this conversation, and keep this conversation active so that it doesn't end in this Zoom, but it's something that we continue to have around the living room, around the dining room table, so that we keep these issues alive. Even if you disagree with me, you don't have to agree with me 100%. But I think the idea of building bridges and having discourse, even across lines of difference, is something that we desperately need right now to be able to learn with and from each other, particularly in this moment when there's so much polarization. So I welcome that. And I hope that you will do as well.
Thank you. So I'll let you decide whether or not you feel like you've sufficiently covered the question on cathedral thinking in a system that increasingly shields presidential power. But I'll go to the next one. What have been the biggest problems or trials you have confronted in LCR? What are the most crucial lessons you have learned during that time?
And well, I think one of the biggest problems is that we know that these problems are entrenched, that these problems are long-term problems, and that you're not going to find solutions overnight. People might come to us because something terrible happened today, right? You don't call lawyers for civil rights on your best day. Probably call lawyers for civil rights on your worst day. And knowing that there are going to be delays in the administration of justice, that there are going to be often an uphill battle, like I was describing in the Birthright citizenship litigation. This isn't going to be a walk through the park. It's not like the government's going to give up their arguments. They're doing this with intentionality. And so we also have to do this with intentionality, but it also takes a lot of resourcefulness and resilience and keeping that long-term look. And I think that it's often, especially on hard days, to think through that, right? So like often your clients want something that's immediate because they're living through uncertainty, and nobody wants to live through uncertainty. And we're dealing with institutions that often move slowly, right? That don't just turn on a dime. And so keeping that long-term ethos moving is probably one of the most challenging elements of our work, but at the same time, one of the most fundamental and most important. And thinking about how we proactively respond to the world around us, as well as what are cases that we want to be developing in order to protect communities, right? So it's not just responding to everything that the federal government is doing or saying, but thinking about other interventions that really should not be falling through the cracks. Everybody's attention right now is on the White House, but what's happening at the local level is just as important. What's happening at the state level is just as important. And so that triage, right? Like what we're doing now versus what we're doing tomorrow, and what are the victories that we're securing now, and how are we teeing up victories for tomorrow, are some of the most challenging elements of our work, and at the same time, some of the most important elements. And so I think that process is one that requires tremendous patience, and one that can be really rewarding when it bears fruit. But it's one where we have to be patient, right? Like things like Brown versus Board of Education don't happen overnight. They didn't happen overnight in 1954. They don't happen overnight today. And so that long-term view is important to cultivate.
Thank you. So another one, what recourse do we have when administration ignores the courts, deports immigrants without due process, and refuses to participate in court procedures in good faith?
That's certainly one of the things that people have been talking about a lot in the past few months. But we've also seen compliance. There's been overwhelmingly more compliance than non-compliance. We are not living in a universe where the government is ignoring federal court rulings nilly-willy, right? That's just not the reality. And many of the messages that we are seeing are that the court rulings need to be upheld. And there's also an important element here. As some people have said, and I appreciate it, the president has the Supreme Court on speed dial. And that might be an element to think about. But putting that aside, what we are seeing is much of the regular process of litigation unfold. We file a complaint, they respond, we have a court hearing, we show up, they show up. And so the hallmarks of the adversarial system remain in place. And that is vital. And so we may not be securing all of the outcomes that we want, especially as things percolate to the Supreme Court, but nobody wins 100%. So it's important to remember. But the hallmarks of the adversarial system remain. And some of the, I think, underpinnings of this question are raising what have been outliers or have been activities that have been corrected as criticism and as visibility of these issues has continued. For example, the immigrant who was sent to El Salvador, who was essentially ordered to be returned to the United States, was subsequently returned. And so when you think about it, there's certainly a push and pull. There is the adversarial system working in many ways. And it's like I've been saying, this is not going to be a walk through the park. This is going to take intense advocacy and intense lawyering, intense litigation, but the system is holding. And many of the rulings, especially from the lower federal courts, have been extremely empowering and uplifting with language that many of us would applaud. And so I think it's important for us not to lose sight of the instances where the system is working and continuing to build off of that success, and then at the same time focusing on those outliers to course correct. But let's not ignore the fact that the adversarial system has been working, even if the outcomes are unpredictable. And so we have to keep working at it and keep continuing to put pressure, even on the courts, to be more expeditious, to be more complete, more clear in their rulings, so that we don't enter spaces with ambiguity or where the government has too much leeway to act in ways that we don't want them to be acting in. And so that takes course correcting that is important to be doing in real time, and takes also finessing how we are navigating the judicial system right now, with a federal government that believes in a very, very broad interpretation of executive power and executive privilege. And so that's a reality. That's the federal government's interpretation of those principles, and we have to be the ones who, in the community, in court, continue to push back, so that the traditional way of thinking about this, where what the court says is what all parties respect, is the way that we move forward. And so don't let those outliers be what takes your attention. Like, focus on the fact that the adversarial system is working. Now let's try to fix some of the outcomes, but have faith and trust in the institutions. And if we want to reform those institutions, then by all means, we should be talking about what that reform looks like. So I'm not shying away from that, but let's also work within the system that we have, which, like I've alluded to before, is something that even in the region of the world where I come from doesn't exist. And so let's harness it here for good.
Thank you, Ivan. So I am going to do this other question that just came in, because it represents a segment that I think we also need to talk about, and this actually bridges into the next stage of our conversation. More of a suggestion than a question, but I'm Gen Z and would say a simple TikTok post asking for content creator volunteers at LCR gain funding, visibility through public viewership support in Boston. I'm in the UK. However, would you say that be viable? So I think every nonprofit, maybe it's every business, every person who's out there trying to, especially when the message transcends the generations, are trying to get to the younger generation, the generation who maybe right now they're thinking about the first time that they're going to walk into or mail a ballot. They're going to walk into a polling location. How does LCR, or do you talk to the TikTok generation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a couple of things that this question makes me think about. One is, I heard the other day somebody saying, well, I'm just not used to the government not affirming my identity. And I thought about that, and I kept thinking, when has the government ever been in the business of affirming our identity? Like, it's something that we have had to push, poke and prod to get accomplished. It's not something that is a given. It's a constant battle. And so it's really important for us to be thinking about that, to be thinking about how some of the assumptions that we have about the government, about institutions, if we want a government that affirms our identity, then that's what we need to be pushing for, right? But that shouldn't be the assumption out of the gate, is that, well, the government has always affirmed my identity and the government will always affirm my identity. No, it won't. It won't without constant vigilance, and it won't without constant monitoring. And so that poking, that prodding is something that needs to continue to happen in order for the government to actually reflect what we want it to reflect, and to express the protections that we wanted to protect, including the identities that we wanted to protect. And so that's something that I think is important, particularly for some of the younger generations that may be interfacing with government for the first time and going out to exercise to vote, and then being disappointed with the outcome or being disappointed with the way that the government is handling certain things. And I think it's critical for us not to let them steal our sparkle, to remember that that is a struggle and a fight that has to be active, and that it takes that vigilance in that. And what I do love is that oftentimes the vigilance is happening through social media. The vigilance is happening through advocacy that is digital in nature. That, you know, the definition of what town square is today is very different from what it was before. And so when you think about, you know, go to the town square, organize a protest, or go tell it on a mountain, that the way that these things manifest today is very different from the way it was in previous generations. And I love that. And I think we need to do much more work to align ourselves with those public spaces and public squares that have been created digitally. I'll be the first to admit that our social media presence at Lawyers for Civil Rights is relatively weak. It's not our strong suit. We're good litigators, not good social media navigators. And so these are things that we need to continue to shore up. I have seen some organizations creating roles like social media organizers, which are kind of like taking your traditional community organizer role, but instead of having them interface in person or at the community level on the ground with folks, you're doing it all digitally. And that's been now a trend for some time, but more and more organizations, even smaller ones like Lawyers for Civil Rights, are starting to think about moving in that direction, which I think is a wonderful way to activate. Because if what we want is to get some of this messaging out, what we want is to make sure that we're relevant in those spaces, that's what we need to do. And that's the way that we get the government to reflect the values that we want and to defend the identities that we feel are important to defend, right? Like, these things are interconnected. And the more that we can stress that on social media, the better. Because if you look at recent data about where people are getting their news, you know, people are not necessarily getting their news from the printed newspaper, not everyone. And you're also seeing the demise of many local newspapers, which means that the way local developments are percolating is often through social media. You know, I heard an explosion. You don't go to the newspaper, you go to social media to find out who's reporting what, who's uploaded photos, and understanding what those dynamics are. And so I think we have a tremendous opportunity to capitalize on social media organizing, social media mobilizing. And that is one of the ways that we could be thinking about how to be changing hearts and minds in the next few years. And so I appreciate the question with a shameful admission that at Lawyers for Civil Rights, we have not done the best in terms of curating our social media experience, but something that we continue to think through and think about in terms of how we can show up better in those spaces, because we know those are portals for advocacy and portal particularly for younger generations. to be engaged. And so that's important. And I love that, that right now in the webinar chat, there's information being shared about how social media is even being used to provide real-time information on current community events. And so all of this is happening, right? This is happening organically. And in so many ways, legacy advocacy organizations, anchor advocacy organizations like Lawyers for Civil Rights is kind of late to the game, and we have to catch up. And this is an important element also because it reiterates the importance of learning across generations and how power sharing is vital. If the folks who are in tune to these digital developments are younger, then they should have a seat at the table to be able to direct how these strategies are being implemented and deployed, right? It shouldn't be somebody like me who can't log into TikTok directing how TikTok advocacy is going to work. And so that's important. And it's something that frankly, we don't talk enough about. It's almost like an afterthought. And when we put it as an afterthought, we are also relegating the populations that rely on those news sources as an afterthought. And so it's something that we actively have to break that digital divide to make sure that we stay current. And so I appreciate the question because I think it has a lot of different nuances about how we hold ourselves and the government accountable, and also about ways to engage that may look different across generations and that can be equally effective. And so for sure, social media, its relevance, and we need to really leverage that as we move forward with strategies for civil rights enforcement, immigration, all of that jazz.
Thank you, Ivan. Okay, so I'm going to pivot. We're going to talk a little bit about the cathedral and building of the cathedral, and we're going to do it in relationship to the Colosseum that's being built next door. The forces who are trying to work against or who are trying to build their own superstructure that is multi-generational. What I wrote when you were first talking about the cathedral and how it was being built, and that you place the stone knowing that you will never see the finished wall or the structure, stand in its awe. What I get also, and I am a very positive person, in this I will go a little bit negative or to the opposite. There are people, organizations who see the world differently than we do, and they are building their own structure. Where are those efforts coming from? Where did they originate? How are they funded? And who is lobbying for them? We can go as deep or as broad as you want, but one of the organizations that comes to mind is ALEC. That's one that we talk about in the center. And really, what are things that an informed citizen, in addition to knowing what your rights are with regards to recording law enforcement, among others, who should we know to be fully aware of what's happening in our country now?
Brandy, that's a complex and layered question, and I'll try to navigate it as best as I can. With a reminder that at Lawyers for Civil Rights, we're nonpartisan. We work with both sides of the aisle. We have since the civil rights movement. and that what we really stand for is for making sure that people's constitutional rights are not being violated, and that we continue to enforce civil rights in all of the contexts that are relevant today. And I think one immediate reaction that I have to your question is that, and it's something that I've been saying a lot since January, is that local inaction, state inaction, is just as bad as federal action. And so if we do not leverage and capitalize on local opportunities for action, on state opportunities for action, it's just as bad. And so we can't just sit here and point the finger at certain federal activities when there is no corresponding response being taken by the local or state government to keep folks safe. And I think that's really important, because it's easy to point the finger and say, oh, the feds are the blame. It's the federal government that's doing this. It's the federal government that should be responsible for this. It's the federal government that's ruining your life. But then the question remains, well, how is the local or state government helping me and supporting me in any way, especially in the absence of the federal government? And I'll give you an example. Like I've seen, and I'll give you an example in a space that's not controversial, I hope. Like I've seen the closure of small business administration regional offices, which used to help small businesses with getting launched, being able to get entrepreneurs off the ground. And now those small business administration SBA offices are closed or closing, and depending on where you are in the country. And I kept thinking to myself, well, what's going to happen now? Well, if the federal government is leaving a vacuum, is leaving this gap in service in this landscape, then where is the local government or state government stepping in to help meet the need that is being left by the federal government retreating from these spaces? And this is not just happening in the small business world. This is happening in many different spaces. We've all seen the news, especially the last few days, about the Department of Education, about the closure of the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education. Well, many states have their own departments of education. Many states have the type of offices that provide support, like the Office for Civil Rights. Have we seen any type of guidance and uptick in the type of support that these local or state players are giving as the feds retreat? Not necessarily. And so for me, I keep thinking about this exactly in the way that these small business offices are being closed, and there's not necessarily infrastructure being built or services being provided to make up the difference. And so I think there's a lot here to unpack in terms of how we're responding to changes in the nature of the federal government, or not responding, as the case may be. And I think the answer, I mean, I think I'm kind of leading you where I fall on this, which is I think we need to do a lot more work to build the infrastructure that steps in the absence of the federal enforcement, in the absence of the federal oversight, in the absence of the federal support. And there hasn't been enough of that. And when those initiatives or programs get built and launched at the local or state level, how are we doing it in a way where we're creating a blueprint for others to be able to take action and emulate? Like, this is a space where we want copycats, where we want people to take the best ideas and be able to run with them and apply them locally based on their own circumstances in ways that make sense for them. And yet we're not seeing a ton of that. At Lawyers for Civil Rights, one of the ways that we've been dealing with this is as we're doing work in novel areas, in areas that are unusual. For example, we recently filed a complaint under the Federal Torts Claim Act, the FTCA, for an incident where a passenger was forcibly removed, dragged out of a car after immigration officers smashed the car window. That is a practice that didn't happen before. This is new. This started happening under the Trump administration this year, in just the last couple of months. And so when you look around, you don't necessarily see a lot of template complaints or sample complaints. And so what we did is that we made our complaint public. We told people, like, this is our complaint, take it and run with it. If you have similar cases that are happening in your jurisdiction, just make sure you update the law so that if you're filing it in California, you're using the California standards. And if you're filing it in Florida, you use the Florida standards. But we did that very, very much with the idea of how are we creating blueprints for advocacy for other people to be able to take them and run with them. And I think there's a lot of that that's missing right now. It's there's a lot of, as I was mentioning earlier, a lot of strategic silence, a lot of people being benched. And in that silence, in us being benched and not out in the field, it creates room for only certain voices, only certain perspectives, only certain views, only certain priorities to emerge. And those might not be the ones that are aligned with your values. Those might not be the ones that you want to see out in the world. And so, like I mentioned earlier, like, I'm not here to call anyone racist or to call anybody like a bad actor, but most certainly what I know that I'm here to do is to protect the clients that I represent whose rights have been violated, whose constitutional rights have been violated, and to do that in ways that makes them whole, but that also helps to uplift others in that process. And that's by creating blueprints for advocacy that other people can run with. And that's also by encouraging action, by encouraging people to not leave that void unfilled, by encouraging greater involvement, even if it's a matter of something as simple as we're going to create a local small business office to be able to guide entrepreneurs for how they walk through entrepreneurship, establishing their corporation or procurement. Like, that's a function that municipalities can take on, or that counties or states can take on in the absence of the federal SBA. And so I know I'm answering your question more with a question, but my question is, why haven't we seen that? Why haven't we seen more of that in the past few months? And why is it taking it so long for more actors to be deployed? And I think a part of that is also public pressure. Like, we need more public pressure. We need more people saying, okay, we don't have the SBA, so what are we going to do now? And asking those questions and creating a demand for that, which is why I had enumerated earlier outreach to elected officials, not just in blue states, but in red states, where you're letting them know what you want to see. Like, I cared about the SBA. I hate to see it gone. And what are we doing now? Like, that's important to voice, right? And that doesn't have to be partisan, and that doesn't have to be divisive or polarizing. And so, in my view, what we need to do in this moment is to have a lot more agency and to have a lot more engagement and mobilization, and to do that based on the values that we want to see reflected in the world. And right now, frankly, there's just not enough of that happening. When you look at an organization like Lawyers for Civil Rights, we're 10 people. We run out of a budget that is relatively small, just a couple $1 million. This is not a big organization by any means, by any stretch, either on the financial or staff front. And yet we filed one of the first birthright citizenship cases in this country. We are leading some of the most cutting edge work on not just the immigration front, but in the civil rights front. And we're doing that because we're acting from a sense of urgency, and we're acting from a sense of making sure that we are lifting as we climb, and that we're bringing others along. And so for me, I hope that other people get inspired by that, and that makes them ask themselves, like, well, what can I be doing, right? If that little organization with 10 people can do this, then maybe I could pull this rabbit out of a hat, or I could be doing that other intervention. And I think that's the way we move this forward, and move that forward, staying focused on the positive interventions and what are the things that we are constructing in that cathedral and how we're laying that stone, and less focused on the negative elements, right? It's again almost like that question about, well, maybe they are not complying with a court order, but in 99.99% of cases they are. And so let's build from the point of institutionalizing. Let's build from the point of creating what we want to see happen. And so for me, I think about this as a challenge of how do I create the vehicles that I want to see? How am I creating the blueprints that I want to put out into the world? And how am I challenging other people to also take action? That's how I see it. And when I focus on that, I'm less and less afraid, and also less and less concerned about how orchestrated the opposition is. It's about making sure we're orchestrated in our own efforts and in building what we need to build, right? Like, let's not get distracted. Let's not lose the forest for the trees, or the trees for the forest. I'm bad at the metaphors, but you got where I'm going in terms of, let's make sure that we're building and institutionalizing what we want to build and institutionalize. And that's one case at a time, one tweet at a time, one TikTok at a time, one protest at a time, one phone call at a time. But each of those are interventions. That's the stone. That's the laying the stone that takes us there. And I think that's the way that we have to see it as we continue to work towards the vision of justice and equality and dignity and respect that we want to have here.
Thank you, Ivan. Talking about this process of building, I want to go back to the building of Ivan, and also talk a little bit about my own. But, you know, when did you, in your experience coming from Costa Rica to the US, when did you decide, what were the seeds that were planted to bring you to the career as a attorney?
I think the desire and interest to be a lawyer for me has been longstanding ever since I was a kid, and my earliest memories of this is from my own immigrant experience, from when we first arrived in the United States. As I mentioned earlier, I arrived in the US when I was a little kid. My family had a lot of struggles. We lived in a low-income community. We didn't have access to many resources. And in the first year that I lived here, I remember seeing so many different needs and pressures in my own community, and the critical need for an advocate and for legal representation. It's, well, if the landlord comes knocking on the door and you don't have the rent money, like, what can the landlord do to you or not do to you? If you get pulled over by the police and you're getting pulled over for doing nothing, for no reason, because that happens in some communities, what are your rights? What can you do or not do? What can the police do or not do to you? And those were some of the concerns that really fueled my interest in becoming a lawyer. So as far back as being 9 years old, I remember thinking about this, about what are my rights? What can they do to me? What can they do to my mom? And how do we stay safe? And that interest in making sure that my family was safe is what catapulted me to become a lawyer and really inspired me to go to college, to go to law school, and to do the work that I do today. And as I was talking about at the beginning of the chat, the work that I do today is very much aligned with protecting people in the type of community where I grew up, low-income people and other vulnerable communities. I mentioned some of the residents in the mobile home community that we're currently representing from spikes in their rent, for example. Like, all of this work is so important, and it's a unifying force across differences and across communities. And so the interest to be an advocate comes from my own lived experience with struggle and challenges, and an understanding that it really takes advocacy to be able to move the needle. And I'm very privileged and blessed to be able to do the work that I do today on behalf of people who are extremely vulnerable. Almost every case that I work on reminds me of my own family, reminds me of the struggles that my family lived through and had to overcome. Many of the cases that I work on remind me of my mom, and that is something that's deeply personal to me, but that's also inspired me professionally to do the work that I do. And so that is why we do the work with a tremendous sense of urgency. And that's why right out of the gate on Inauguration Day, we were filing that Birthright citizenship case. And that's why when folks like the mobile home residents call us, we ask, not if we can help, but how we can help. And so it's important to think about it from that perspective. And that perspective for me is informed by my own lived experience, my experience with poverty, my immigrant experience, and my experience with disparities, and how overcoming those disparities is often based on some type of legal proceeding and access to justice and access to advocacy. And so for me, being able to give that back to a society that has afforded me so much privilege is truly an honor to be able to do.
Thank you. Okay, so Stephanie dropped this in the chat really quick. You wrote a kid's book, and we're going to talk about kids in a second, but I want you to tell us the name and why you did it, and where folks should purchase, where you would like them to purchase it from.
That I was not expecting that one. Yes. So on my free time, I have so much free time, as you can imagine. On my limited free time, I actually wrote a children's book. I wrote it during the pandemic, and I found it very therapeutic. I like writing. I enjoy writing. It's therapeutic for me to write. I think it's important for all of us to share our ideas with the universe. I feel that the tapestry of the universe gets enriched each time we share our experiences and our perspectives. And so I very much encourage my staff, for example, to write and to publish. And I typically focus on publishing legal pieces, legal commentary, which I enjoy thoroughly and have a lot of, it's cathartic to write those, but I have to say that writing the book was fun. It was very fun, and I started writing it just as the pandemic hit, and the book touches on themes of diversity and inclusion, and learning across difference, which are themes that have defined my professional work. and also focus on the importance of getting outdoors and getting fresh air, which were vital topics during the pandemic. And so I wrote a children's book about the experience of my dog, Obi, going from Boston to the Berkshires to run around and get fresh air and be in a new and different environment where he would be hanging out with new and different creatures who were different from the ones that he would encounter in the city park. And so that experience was captured in a book called Obi's Adventures in the Berkshires, and it was fun to write. My mom jokes that my dog is famous and he doesn't even know it. But the book has been selected as a finalist for the Next Gen Indie Book Awards for LGBT fiction, and that was really nice to see. And it was nice to be able to share a little bit about how a dog's experience with difference and with resilience has lessons for all of us.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry to catch you off guard. I didn't think that that was possible, but I'm glad to have mentioned it and to know more about the book. Hopefully, for those of you who are listening and listen in the future with the recording, may be able to purchase it, a copy, and have it on your kids' library. So, personally, I remember going as a child from the 80s. I remember coming up during the AIDS crisis, during a lot of political, I will say political upheaval. I'll just leave it at that. I also, from an adoptive dad perspective, from a gay men's perspective, this idea of and when you were talking about the person who was saying, you know, the idea of the government not affirming my identity, I almost fell over because I very much remember a time when the government in whole seemingly did not affirm my identity or the way that I wanted to structure my family. So I'll go into a couple pointed questions about in this situation right now, and I will also try and keep it positive. So what are the things that, we'll say a gay American, maybe a gay American who is also an immigrant, and this includes the whole spectrum, the LGBTQ plus, our trans brothers and sisters. What should we know? What should we hold as a source of power and inspiration for this time in our country?
I love the question, and I particularly love it because it raises the intersectionality between so many different lived experiences and how we interface with the government at different stages, right? And as I hear your question and I think about these experiences, I'm openly gay, and part of my book is actually the reason why I also wanted to write the book is because we've been living through a moment of censorship in this country where there's so much opposition even for hosting drug story hours in public libraries or community spaces, and people find that very threatening, and also a lot of revisiting of narratives that people don't think should exist in the American canon, that shouldn't be a part of our society, particularly LGBT and trans voices and experiences, and often LGBT voices of color who are being silenced as well, and trans voices of color. And so in writing the book, I was also reacting to some of that. I was reacting to the fact that there are so few positive narratives of same-sex couples and of kids being raised by same-sex families. And I don't have children, so I didn't write about children, but I have a dog being raised by a same-sex couple. And so I wrote about that, and to both normalize that and to try to create opportunities for those narratives to enter the mainstream. And I'm really glad that I did in the moment that I did during the pandemic, and as we've continued to move forward in many ways with the silencing, with the censorship, which is dangerous. Like I said, like we need to all be writing. All of us, regardless of where you fall in the political spectrum, we should be sharing our thoughts and our feelings and our sentiments and contributing to that American canon instead of silencing those voices and perspectives. Because we, in the marketplace of ideas, like we are enriched when everybody's sharing theirs, and then have the best ideas win. That's important. And as we look at the way LGBT and particularly trans people have been treated over the past year in particular, it's concerning. It's concerning. The recent Supreme Court decision concerning access to hormones for younger trans people. In many ways, a decision that's been interpreted by experts as taking away autonomy and decision making from youth themselves, from family members, and from medical experts. So that's an area of concern. Even though at Lawyers for Civil Rights we don't work on these issues, it's certainly an area where we are monitoring that landscape and seeing how a restriction on individual liberties could manifest in ways that are dangerous in other spaces. And the particularly the way that the Trump administration has come after cultural institutions that refuse to fall in line with the official vision and narrative that the federal government wants to have. You look at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., and the takeover of the Kennedy Center, and the very expressed reason for the takeover of the Kennedy Center being that they had drag shows or drag story hours or some type of cultural manifestation that was affirming and supportive of trans voices or trans experiences, that made them bad, that made them punishable, and that made them an institution that needed to be reformed. It's really scary and dangerous. I wrote an article talking about how the takeover of the Kennedy Center was extremely problematic on First Amendment grounds. And I've done some writing recently, particularly on the drag shows and these types of manifestations of culture. The bottom line is that the government should not be in the business of telling us whose voices and experiences matter more, that some voices and experiences matter less. And the times that the government has done that, we've run into serious problems, like at the height of the HIV epidemic. And now, as we continue to work in a terrain where trans voices and experiences in particular are being sidelined, that's extremely dangerous. And we should be a lot more mindful of how we're thinking about these issues. And I'll give you an example of how this learning is something that needs to happen even in progressive spaces. At my organization, we were doing a brief that we were submitting to a high court on issues of police profiling, ways that police are interfacing with civilians improperly in terms of surveillance and profiling, and ways that the court should be providing support or thinking about these issues for more accountability and transparency. And in the middle of writing this brief, it kind of dawned on us around the table that we're talking a lot about driving while Black and other types of experiences where racial profiling is involved, but that we hadn't focused much on walking while trans or other experiences of trans folks who are also interfacing with law enforcement. And so what we did is we put pencils down and we started thinking about this from a more inclusive perspective. How can we cast a bigger net? How can we talk about these issues of profiling and surveillance from the perspective of not just one community or one dimensionally, but from other communities? And I think that's important. It's important for us to challenge ourselves. If we typically talk about profiling exclusively along racial lines, well, maybe we should be thinking about how LGBT experiences can be reflected there. And if we usually care about how the government interfaces with people of color, maybe we should be caring about the way that the government's also interfacing with LGBT people. And so these things are not disconnected. And the more that we raise the similarities and we raise the connective tissue between them, I think we're all better off for that. And especially now when particularly the government has really tried to limit progress on trans issues, whether it's trans in the military, whether it's access to other services. It's really incumbent on us to make sure that all of these identities are being recognized and not being left behind. And so the issue of LGBT awareness and LGBT inclusion is one that is also part and parcel of the civil rights movement, because LGBT people come in all colors, shapes, and sizes. And so it's important to be thinking about these issues very intersectionally. And unfortunately, we often aren't. We're often thinking one-dimensionally, or staying in our lane without realizing that we have opportunities like that brief to be able to advocate for others. And so we've tried to find those opportunities. We've tried to make room and learn as we go, because even in progressive spaces, we need to check ourselves and we need to make sure that we are casting the net wide enough. And if there are communities that are being left behind, then we need to take action to correct that. And it's hard. It's hard for groups to say, oh, we could have done better, or we should have been more inclusive. But there are opportunities for that, and we shouldn't shy away from them, which is precisely why I talk about that brief, because for us, it was one of those moments where we could have made a call of just filing what we had, and that would have been fine. That would have been great. That wouldn't have been the right thing to do.
Thank you. Okay, so we're getting short on time. I want to ask, I think what will probably be my final question, and it's about ICE. I don't want to make it too complicated, so I will just say, because we have a lot of questions about ICE and rights as far as safely intervening, maybe intervening isn't the right word. What, from a lay person's perspective, what is ICE? What if you see something that seems to be not right? If you are making the observation, what are your rights as far as intervening? And what can you do to help someone who may be targeted?
Well, so this, and I actually wrote an article specifically on this issue back in February, which I published in WBUR, which is a NPR affiliate. The article was called "What to Do If ICE Comes Knocking." And in that article, I walk through a number of different scenarios. One of the most, and I'll just do a very, because I know we're running low on time, a quick summary, but I would encourage folks to check it out because it has a lot of very practical information. I kind of did it as almost like a fact sheet where you walk through different scenarios. One of the most fundamental things is your home is your castle. And so if any law enforcement official, this isn't just about immigration, these are the same rights that would apply if you're interfacing with police or with another law enforcement official. If somebody's coming to your house, you don't have to let them in without a warrant. That's your fundamental right. And that's something that that many people don't realize. I mean, just even that basic thing of you don't have an obligation to open your door unless there's a judicial warrant issued by a court, issued by a magistrate that says that law enforcement official has the right to come in. And the Trump administration may wish that was not the case, but the law is the law, and that's a very clear law. The difficulty and the challenging part comes from many of the dynamics that many of us take for granted, but that are real. If somebody knocks on the door or rings the doorbell, and a kid in the household is really excited and runs to the door and opens it, that's consent, right? They open the door. And so it doesn't matter that a kid opened the door or that an adult opened the door. Opening the door is opening the door. And so how do you stay safe often requires rethinking these basic transactions. Like, I'm not going to just open a door if I hear the doorbell, or I'm going to tell my kids not just to assume that it's a friendly person on the other side and that they should rush to open a door. But that requires practice and culture change from the way that we generally operate. And people ask, well, what can I do in those situations? Well, if law enforcement knocks on the door, you should ask to see the warrant, and the warrant can be passed under the door or displayed by a window near the door, so that you can ascertain the validity of the warrant, and so that you know whether or not you have an obligation to open the door. And much of the same scenario would unfold in a workplace, for example. The law enforcement officials would have the ability to go into a public space, just like everybody, all of us have the right to go into a public space, but they wouldn't have the right to go into a private space. And so having that separation of space is something that is completely lawful, provided that it follows your business needs and the business operations that are happening there. So think of a restaurant. The tables out front, public, but the kitchen, private, right? Randy, you don't go to the restaurant and go into the kitchen and see what the cook's doing. Like, that's a private space. And so the demarcation of private and public makes sense. It's the way businesses operate. And so thinking about that from the law enforcement perspective is also useful. Now, I think it's critical to also mention that no one should ever block immigration officials. No one should ever obstruct an immigration official. That is something you cannot do, even if you believe they're overstepping, even if you believe that they're crossing the line, that they may have crossed some legal boundary. Like, you should not be interfering, you should not be obstructing. that could be a criminal offense. And then we've seen instances where immigration is taking, and federal officials have taken a very strong line about this and have sought or actually pressed charges for interfering with a federal investigation. And so people need to be aware of that. Many people say to me, oh, I'm just going to do what I'm going to do. And it's like, you have agency. I can't tell you what to do or not to do. Like, everybody has agency. But what I can tell you is that if you interfere, if you block, that is a criminal offense that they can then prosecute. And I also add that in some ways, don't underestimate that they want to create that provocation, that they want to catch you interfering or blocking, because that feeds into their narrative that there are people who are obstructing, that there are people that are interfering. And so I think it's not helpful when people take the posture that they're going to interfere or block. It's not helpful. In all of the instances we've seen, the immigrants at issue still get taken by ICE. And then after that happens, the individuals are pressed with charges. And so nobody needs that. Nobody wants that. And so don't leave this Zoom thinking I'm going to be the hero and I'm going to stop this. This is not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is you should be informed about your rights, like your right not to open a door if there isn't a warrant, or your right to record, and that should be based on what state you're in, and also to record in a way that's safe for you and for the officials, right? Not all up in their face, not in a way that could be interpreted as interfering or obstructing or blocking them, right? Like if they tell you to move back and move back to a respectful distance, but continue to record. And so thinking about that as ways that you can have an impact without interfering, without blocking, because nobody needs to be arrested. Nobody wants to be arrested. And so these are issues that are really important. And I'm glad that that there have been resources shared in the chat so that folks also have ready access to that information, which can be a lot more detailed and a lot more complex. But I'm giving you the highlights, and certainly among the highlights is don't obstruct, don't interfere, but you have the right to observe. In many states, you even have the right to record, and you certainly have the right not to answer questions. You have the right to request an attorney. You have the right not to open your door unless it's in response to a warrant. And so grounding yourself in those basic fundamental rights that we all have is incredibly important. And knowing that and being able to assert that is half the battle. And so be informed, stay aware, stay engaged, and keep the conversation going to be able to protect yourself and to be able to help create the world that we all want to create by laying one stone at a time.
Yvonne, I'm going to close out. Thank you so much for your time and for adding to the rich tapestry of our world in the work that you do. Paul, I'm going to hand it over to you, and to everyone, good night.
Again, I'm going to chime in with Randy and thank you, Yvonne, for being with us this evening. I also want to thank all of you who attended this evening to the presentation. Also, I want to remind you all that there's a nationwide protest on July 17th, which is the civil rights icon John Lewis's birthday. Good troubles live on. Plan to participate and show those who want to destroy our democracy you are here to protect the human rights of all people. That's what human reconciliation is about. Again, thank you, Yvonne. Thank you to the people that participated this evening. Stay safe.